Mr. Martin, thank you so much for tuning in, and welcome to Light 'em Up. An absolute pleasure.
Hey, thank you. It's good to be here.
Mr. Martin, but it's great to have you, and it's been a bit in the making, and I'm truly honored to have you and welcome you. Well, RoMa Craft, it wears craft in the name, and it shines through with everything that you do with the company, all the designs, the headquarters. I mean, just the backdrop that you have there. What does the term craft actually mean to you?
Well, I think I mean the literal definition is it's the act of making something by hand, which I think encompasses the hecho a mano, everything in the cigar, in our side of the cigar business, is focused on this centuries old craft of making cigars from tobacco by hand. But for us, it's also for us, it has a little bit of a deeper meaning in terms of it being at the center of what we're doing. Where we're focused more on kind of the aspect of doing things, in a smaller scale, and doing it kind of more direct. There's cigar factories that make, millions of cigars, 30, 40, 50 million cigars a year. And then there's cigar factories that make, 200,000 cigars a year. In either one of those, you have, at the base unit, you have, one pair, outside of Cuba, you have one pair of rollers that are making, anywhere between 150 to 350, 500 cigars a day, right? So the bigger factories really just have more pairs. For us, there's a couple of things. One is, our guys, depending on the size they're making, we don't focus on quantity as much as we focus on quality. But really, at the outside of that difference is the type of tobacco we use. We really focused on using the top 10-15% of each of the kinds of tobaccos that we use, and of course it's it's a little more involved in terms of time and the attention you pay to taking care of those kinds of materials. But I think we're living in a time where almost every cigar out there is really good quality, especially here in the United States. Of course, you can walk into a European humidor and you can find cigars that are not going to draw well or smoke well because there's cigars in there from Cuba, and that's just kind of one of the hallmarks these days of Cuban cigars. But especially New World cigars, you're not going to find in a European humidor a cigar that is below first grade kind of quality. And that's also true here in the United States, even though the humidors in the United States are larger generally. Almost every cigar you're going to find in there is really of first quality in terms of construction, in terms of the time that the tobacco was fermented and cured. But for us, what we try to do is focus on higher texture tobaccos, higher priming tobaccos, which sometimes means stronger cigars, and then also kind of being consistent with that kind of level of quality that you see from all the cigar makers. So much like in the beer world, you have mass market beer that has kind of no discernible taste, right, or distinction. That kind of thing really isn't a part of our industry. And then you have kind of medium market kind of things, like, for example, you have really good high quality beers in Germany, for example, but they're all very similar in terms of body and strength and those kinds of things. But then in the craft beer world, like if you go to Amsterdam or if you go to Belgium and you go into kind of places like the different kind of I'm trying to think of one in particular. what's the cafe I'm thinking of? The beer starts with a D. I'll remember in a second. But they have hundreds and hundreds of kinds of beers from all over the world. And when you start seeing the really small makers, you start seeing things like really heavy stouts with adjuncts, and you start seeing really kind of far out there varieties of beer that are a lot different than what you would see in the mainstream. And our blends are a lot like that, tobaccos like Arapiraca, which weren't very popular when we started making our cigar about 8 or 9 years ago. There have obviously been Arapiraca wrapper cigars, but for that to be a part of our core initial launch, it just kind of is the type of product we make. There's a lot of broadleaf cigars out there, but we use tobacco from 4 different countries in our broadleaf cigars. So that's one of the things about being small is that we get to use a really broad variety of tobaccos, and a lot of them are tobaccos that you won't see on kind of mainstream premium cigars. And then on the further, I would say, because we don't grow our own tobacco, because we aren't limited to or driven to use a lot the tobacco that we grow ourselves, which you see from a lot of big guys, because you can't make 30-40 million cigars generally without growing tobacco, Drew Estate being the exception, obviously. But when you grow tobacco in Jalapa, when you grow tobacco in the Dominican, or say Santiago or wherever, generally you're going to create blends around the core of what the tobacco you grow, and we're not really kind of constrained to any particular kind of component. So all of those things kind of combine into what we kind of consider kind of the craft aspect of cigar making.
By the way, David Blanco just commented over on Facebook that Delirium was the name of the cafe you were
Delirium. Yeah, that's the one I was thinking of.
So we say hello to David, and it's great to see you on the show again.
The problem with the Delirium Cafe is you drink so much you forget the name, right?
Well, what actually sets you off on that journey of craft? I'm curious, because even though craft nowadays is sort of very popular and something that gets people all excited, but it's probably not the first thing you think about when you start your entrepreneurial journey, or when you just enter into a new business. There's probably easier pathways, right? But when did you actually discover your passion and your love for that rather niched down, very specific, high-end, high-quality approach?
Well, when we started about 10 or 11 years ago, in 2010, it wasn't a word that you would hear, craftsmanship or crafter's bench, I think was something Don Kiki used, but you didn't really hear anyone in the cigar business really trying to relate specifically to that kind of movement. And so I have a friend here in Austin, or an acquaintance, who owns a brewery called Jester King. And the whole brand of the brewery was based on being kind of like the opposite of Anheuser-Busch. So you had the king of beers, and then you had the Jester King, right? And the Jester King kind of philosophy, as we talked to him about how he did what he did, was really about, hey, we're going to build this place. We're going to make beers that a lot of people don't necessarily kind of make, sours and other things. But we're also going to maintain the footprint of this place is how big we're going to be. So we're going to make X number of barrels a year, and that's what we're going to be, no matter how popular we become. We're not going to be focused on, traditional distribution. We're not going to be focused on, growing or trying to get to a point where we could sell to another company. This guy had a career before making beer. He liked making beer in his garage. He liked the camaraderie of people, sitting around making beer with people who teach you other things. And at the end of the day, when Mike and I got together, what I realized from my experience of being, kind of tangential to the cigar industry, was there was this path everyone kind of took. A lot of guys would start small because that's just the way you start. And they would talk about being small and not selling anything online and, making differentiated products. They would come out with one or two of the, really differentiated kind of really good tobacco cigars. And then as they became popular, they would try to open every account possible. They would try to make more and more and more, particularly the people who were using contract manufacturers that had the capacity to make more cigars. And then their second and third and fourth lines would be kind of things that were more derivative, just trying to get volume. And then at the end of the day, their focus was to just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And what I realized about the economics of the cigar business was those companies would get to a certain point and either their quality would drop off, or they would be so unavailable and inconsistent that the demand would drop off, or they would stay high quality, high demand, and then they would try to grow, and they would go through this trough of losing money, basically, because of the way the economics of the cigar business works, and they'd never be able to escape the other side. And so there's, even the biggest of companies, Alec Bradley, Rocky Patel, LaFleur, they try really hard to maintain the quality, but they went through these troughs of losing money for years until they kind of got to the 5-10 million cigar a year mark. And for us, I wanted to just stay at this point where the peak of quality, demand, and profitability, without trying to grow through that trough of either low quality or losing money or trying to stretch yourself too thin with customers. So, we designed ourselves in the very beginning. We knew we could make about 30 to 35,000 cigars a week, and maintain all the quality in the terms of the raw material and in terms of the production. And so on the U.S. side, we built our company to be really profitable at 1.5 million cigars a year. We still haven't reached that peak. We're still at about 22 to 25,000 cigars a week, which is perfectly fine for us. I mean, this year, for example, is our most profitable year ever. And our revenue has been about the same for about the last 3 or 4 years. So we're staying about the same in terms of the number of cigars we make. We're staying about the same in terms of the revenue we make. And we're becoming more profitable just as we become more efficient. And we haven't really had an issue. We've maintained our quality at the highest standards. We don't release one of the things about our company is we don't release a lot of new things. We released Cro-Magnon, Aquitaine, Intemperance BA, and Intemperance EC in our first year. And then in 2014, we did Neanderthal. 2016, we did Wonderlust. 2019, we did Baca. But other than, we don't really do in Wonderlust and Baca are really more kind of really small market, once a year kind of things. In one sense, all of our cigars are limited. Even our Cro-Magnon line is our most popular in terms of volume. It's less than 350,000 cigars a year, or 300,000 cigars a year. Some years less than 250,000 cigars a year. Probably our lowest production core line is our Ecuador, Connecticut Intemperance. That's about 200,000, 150,000 cigars a year. So each one of our brands is a very, very, very small footprint from the U.S. market perspective. But from a company perspective, we're really well distributed amongst different kinds of strength profiles and tobacco, and we just work in that zone. And so really, for us, what that enables us to do enables us to sell all of our cigars without advertising, without having salespeople out on the road, without putting a lot of money into demand generation. And so, that for a lot of companies, that's anywhere from 15 to 40% of their budgets. So for us, we're able to take that kind of value advantage on the sales and distribution side and put it into the quality of tobacco. So what we end up really doing is, especially because we have our own factory, what we end up doing is we're able to, from a US perspective, we're able to sell $12, $14 cigars for, $7, $9, $11. So, we're able to deliver, because of the model, a really good value to the customer in terms of quality and price. And then on our side, we're still able to do that while being, really profitable small boutique companies, So, all that was designed from the beginning to be like that. And it's worked out pretty well for us.
You've obviously seen the industry from all various angles, different perspectives with different roles. You have a background as a retailer, as a tobacconist. Would you say that this was a quintessential learning element in order to set up the company differently and follow exactly the path you were describing over the last couple of minutes?
Well, I mean, of course, all my experience informed us from the beginning of kind of the best path to take. I started smoking cigars in the mid '90s, like a lot of people in my age group. So I had a lot of exposure to different brands, especially new companies starting in the '90s that never, got to escape velocity. I saw how different companies dealt with that very big growth from the '90s. I saw how companies dealt with what happened when that demand changed dramatically. Mm-hmm. I've seen how different companies have dealt with supply chain kind of issues. As a consumer, I saw that. And then, when I had the opportunity to start a retail business and start making, start seeing how things looked from a pricing and from a sales side, I realized where the value was, right? Like, the value was understanding where the new products were, understanding, where a company was going in terms of their product lines, how they were doing in terms of managing their own inventories, how best to order from different companies. And then also, where things that they were spending money on that I was paying for, both as a retailer and as a consumer, that I didn't see the value in, right? So trying to eliminate the non-value added kind of things from a consumer's perspective and also from a retail perspective, to eliminate those things to add more value to the product. And then, of course, as a consumer, I thought, man, I could sell cigars. I know everything there is to know. And then when you start selling cigars, you're like, wow, there's a lot I didn't really understand. And then when you're a retailer, you think, oh, well, all these brand guys, I could start my own brand. And then when you actually start a brand, you realize, wait a second, there's a lot I didn't understand. And then once you actually start making cigars, you're like, wow, I don't really understand anything about this business, even though I've been smoking cigars for 20, 25 years. So there is a pretty steep learning curve as you go from one to the other. And there's definitely, I think there's definitely value in having had experience as a consumer, as a blogger early on, new media, whatever, at the beginning of that, social media, seeing the industry from that perspective, being a retailer, seeing it from that perspective, and then, being a brand owner in the States, understanding the way the market works, and then making cigars. And then, when we went into Europe and we started going to Intertobac and distributing through the Schusters, you start realizing how differently the cigar business works outside of the United States, and how fortunate we are, in the United States, that it works the way it does in some ways. In some ways, it's harder here than it is in Europe. But in most ways, it's easier.
Because you can go direct to consumer and you do not have to rely on somebody more in the middle taking care of translating the message from the brand to the people who ultimately smoke your cigars.
Well, I think we go direct to consumer in Europe as well, particularly, amongst the real kind of the guys that would smoke our cigars, are, you know, those kinds of guys. We have friends that we've met, but also that we just know from Facebook or from Instagram that are all over, you know, from, I mean, every country you could think of. We you know, we have people that are actually, we would consider friends, right? That have become fans of our product, or that as hard it is in some places, they find our product and they are able to, you know, understand our story and follow our story.
And I have
I,
to say that I mean the Schuster family is doing a fantastic job in Europe, and Johan, who's here with us in Austria, he just does a tremendous job, and the premium cigar industry in Austria owes a lot to this gentleman, because he's really going for it hard. Or
yeah,
Aldo, like Smoking Moses, who's here. He never stops telling me wonderful stories about RoMa Craft cigars. So I
well,
certainly get what
well,
you're
I'll
from.
give you an example. So, you know, after, usually around Intertobac, we would take a couple of weeks before and a couple of weeks after to travel around Europe. Mostly it's kind of like just for personal reasons, but you know, you work a few business things in there just to make it, you know, semi-legitimate. And so I was taking a vacation 3 or 4 years ago, and we were in Venice, and a guy who I kind of knew from Facebook's, you know, sent me a message, said, "Hey, you know, what are your plans while you're in Italy?" And I said, "Well, we're going to Milan, you know, in a couple of days." And he says, "Well, hey, we've got a club that's between Venice and Milan. Would you mind stopping by?" And I'm like, "Sure." So, you know, my thought process was that, you know, that we'd stop there, there'd be a couple guys, we'd smoke a cigar, eat dinner, and then we'd keep going and we'd go to Milan. Well, our last day in Venice, a guy shows up. He says, "Hey, I'm with this group. I'm gonna make sure you get there." And I'm like, "Oh, wait a second, what's going on?" You know, I'm gonna be, you know, kidnapped, or like I didn't know exactly what's going on. But long story short, we get to this place. It's like in the middle of nowhere, literally between Venice and Milan. And there's like 50, 60, 70 guys that are like huge RoMa Craft fans. And we don't even sell cigars in Italy, right? We don't distribute cigars to Italy. And it's just like, you know, it's like, "Oh, you know, we've been watching your daughter grow up. You know, we love all your meals. You know, hey, here's some Florida Cana rum. We know you like this." And it's like they know all about us, even though, you know, and I had no idea that there were, you know, those pockets of people like that. So, you know, that's an amazing thing. That's different. You know, when I took my first trip down to Honduras, um, you know, there was a very, very small group of people that would interact across, you know, even outside of the boundaries of their local store, much less people that would interact, you know, from around the world. So definitely social media and technology and those things have really expanded ability for a small company like ours to build relationships with end consumers everywhere.
Speaking of social media, the interesting thing is that the cigar industry as such is all about the tradition and the heritage, and the the long-standing history. And then social media comes along and new media comes along. um, there's hardly any innovation in the industry that really, you know, takes a step further. But where do you see sort of the confluence of those two concepts, and where do you think lies that golden path in the middle of the analog and the digital, the old and the new, and the tradition and innovation?
I mean, I think it's a good question because for us, you know, for us, it's all, I've seen all the different iterations, right? Where there's a kind of a cult of personality built around an individual, or where people try to create, you know, a packaging concept, or, you know, some kind of unique, cool thing that they can do to differentiate themselves. And what we decided really early on was at the center of our company has to be the product. It's not about us as a personality. It's not about the fancy packaging. It's not about trying to create some type of cigar product that no one's ever made. What it really is about is just making really good traditional cigars using the same process as everyone has always used. You know, most people who are making cigars, they know exactly how to do it to the highest level of quality. And what happens is, for example, you have back orders for a certain kind of product, like you have a keystone or a product that's really in high demand, that's very profitable, and you need cash in your company, you need cash flow, and the tobacco's over here, or the cigars are made, and maybe they're not quite ready, but you release them anyway, or even though you know better, you do it for reasons that are outside of being product focused. Or you take tobacco that's fermenting and you try to speed up the fermentation, or you try to make your workers, your cigar makers, make more cigars in a day so you could catch up. All those kinds of things are business decisions that are made based on the P&L, based on cash flow, based on trying to keep retailers who are upset about back orders happy, and they're not based on what's the best thing from the product perspective, right? And so for us, we always stay really focused on the product, and then everything else just has to work itself out. Where innovation comes in, I think, for example, there's this really traditional model in the United States. I think 25, 30 years ago, the model was there were distributors, and retailers would only deal with distributors. So there would be this house on the East Coast or the house in the Northeast that would deal with with companies like mine, and they would manage the relationships with the customer. So there was kind of like a middleman, the retailer. And then slowly but surely, bigger retailers started working directly with companies like mine. And those big distribution companies have really become, non-existent in the US. In Europe, you still have that because obviously I can't work direct relationships shipping directly to, a store like in Vienna. But so we have the Schusters, kind of doing that. So that role still exists in Europe for American companies. Even in Europe, you have the big distribution companies like Kohlhauser or these other companies that carry multiple brands, and they're unique to that distributor, right? All over Europe or by country. In the US, what happened was an innovation that happened was people decided, especially within the boundaries of the United States, there was no reason why a distributor in Florida couldn't work with retail stores all across the country. And so they pretty much eliminated that middleman in the United States. And that was an innovation in terms of the model of selling cigars. For us, we took that a step further, and we kind of eliminated even having employees out on the road, and we work with people kind of just from our centralized office. And then you have other innovations like for example, David Blanco's in here. One of the things I saw years ago, David Blanco was making these kind of inserts to put into the boxes. So you would buy the box of cigars, and then when you repurchased, you would get like a thing that was meant to be dropped inside one of the more durable boxes. Because, a big thing, a waste point in our industry is having all these wooden boxes that just pile up inside the retail store, because in the United States, at least, 85-90% of cigar sales are done by individual cigars, not by the box, right? So one of the things we did was we kind of took that idea and said, hey, we're going to, make bundles that are less expensive for the retailer so that they can refill the boxes. That saves us a lot of money in terms of weight of shipping and other things. And then, so that's an example of the kind of things you can do. I don't know if that's innovation. We kind of just took an idea a little further. But now I think more than half of our cigars are shipped to the retail store in bundles. And a lot of times, because they're so high in demand, customers who want to buy boxes, they can't find a box, will buy a bundle and be just as happy, right? Even though bundles generally mean less expensive, lower quality cigars, we've built up the kind of brand, equity where people realize that the box isn't necessary in order to get, the same quality. So those are things that you can do in terms of innovation, but in terms of actually making the cigar, there's really nothing new. Um, every year, we see like Gus Cura does a lot of our tobacco from the Oliva family from Tampa, but they are constantly doing things with, how they humidify tobacco, how they sweat tobacco, how they stack it in the cologne. Is it by hand or by layers or sheets? So there's always little things that they're doing in seed hybridization, or in terms of, for example, a big one in the farms now is drip irrigation and fertilization instead of flood irrigation. So there is a lot of innovation in the sense that we're constantly trying to do things to create better, higher quality tobacco, and also reduce costs between us and the consumer. But when it comes to making a cigar, there really hasn't been much that's changed.
Skip, you mentioned over and over again, and sort of one of the underlying core principles and core values of RoMa Craft, to focus on the very best high quality raw material. In regards to that, Sergey had a question over on Facebook, and he applauds you on RoMa Craft cigars always providing a certain profile, as they share a common distinct denominator in their experience, and it's unlike anything that he wrote he ever encountered. So he would understand how other factories that control their own raw materials would do that, but he asked, how do you achieve it, considering you are purchasing other people's tobacco?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So let me explain, and I've said this a lot over the years, but maybe there's a newer audience that hasn't heard me say this 20 times. So tobacco occurs, like everything in nature, on a bell curve. So if you grow a manzana of tobacco, if you grow a hectare of tobacco, if you grow tobacco at 3 different farms, if you took all that tobacco together and you graded it based on quality, and I'll talk a minute about what that is. There's going to be tobacco in there that's in the bottom 10%. There's going to be a lot of average stuff in the middle, and then there's going to be some stuff that's differentiated on the tail. And generally, what you're talking about is you're talking about soundness of the tobacco, things like insect holes or tears. You're talking about thickness, how consistently it cured in the curing barn. The texture of the tobacco, which is probably the most important thing, and the size of the tobacco. Smaller tobacco with high texture has a lot more flavor than, say, a big thin leaf, right? And so if you take a tobacco, I'd say a typical, we're talking about filler right now, right? So if you take a typical criollo plant from Nicaragua, you're going to have 16 leaves that come off of that plant. So you're going to have 40% of it that's going to be kind of seco texture. You're going to have maybe another 20-30% that's going to be viso texture, and you're going to maybe have 15-20% that's going to be kind of what we call ligero texture. And one of the really broad misconceptions in the cigar world is that ligero is this part of the plant, viso is this part of the plant, seco is this part of the plant. Really, that is true in terms of their position on the plant. But once it, and also it's true once it gets pulled off and put into the curing barn, because you want to cure leaves that are very similar together, similar size, similar texture. But once it goes from the curing barn to sorting to be put into pilones, it's going to be sorted into pilones by texture and size as well. And it really becomes irrelevant where it was on the plant at that point. So you may have some plants that got a lot of water and had really shallow roots and had light sun and shade cover. Maybe it's in the shadow of a tree or something. That whole plant could be 80-90% what we call seco, just because the texture of the leaves, no matter where they came on the plant, is really low. And then you could have some plants that maybe struggled for water, got really deep roots, got a lot of sun, for whatever reason, you could get 40% of really high texture leaves off that plant, or what we would call kind of Ligero, right? So regardless of where it came from on the plant, when you take out 30,000 pounds of tobacco, or you take out this tobacco, once it goes into the pilon, you have certain percentages of certain kinds of textures, and then the more time it spends in the pilon, the less texture the tobacco is going to have. Generally, and these are really basic concepts that anybody that's been around the cigar business is like, this guy's talking like he knows something. I'm just trying to explain basics, right? So when you have, so most of the strength, the flavor, and the actual nicotine strength of tobacco comes from the ridges and surface area and high texture, the flavor. So what happens is, generally, just like you have in, so like, let's say in beer, you have the difference between body and ABV. So in beer, you can have a really high alcohol content light beer that's really refreshing and crisp, but it's very high alcohol. Or you can have a really heavy stout that has very low alcohol, right? You can have like a stout that's almost like syrup that has low alcohol, right? Because they're two different concepts, body and strength. And in tobacco, for a long, long time, body and strength were really the same thing. Because if you had a cigar that was made from really high texture tobacco, it would also come with it the nicotine. So if you wanted to get a lot of flavor and body, you would have to get strength. And if you made a cigar with lower priming tobacco, it would have to be really low, slow fermented over very long periods of time in order to get the really nuanced flavors without having the bad byproducts, right? So, and that's, well, I don't want to go into Cuban cigars, but the thing that we really try to focus on is we really try to focus on getting really high texture tobaccos that can be put into a pilon for a longer period of time, slowly fermented to higher temperature, dropped back down over time, so that you dissipate a lot of the strength in most cases without losing the body and the flavor. And so we have cigars like, for example, our Arapaca, which is 3 different kinds of Ligero. It has tons of flavor in it, which it has to have in order to kind of offset the bitterness of that wrapper. But at the same time, it doesn't have a ton of nicotine, because the kinds of fillers we use, like, for example, we use a tobacco from Leo Reyes in the Dominican. It's very small, very high texture, but it's fermented for a very, very long time, very slowly. So it has a lot of flavor in it, and it burns like a Viso. It tastes like a Viso. I mean, it has a strength like a Viso, but it has the flavor of a Ligero, right? So what we really try to focus on is making, is finding that exact kind of tobacco and working with suppliers so that they know we only use that kind of tobacco. So some years the crops yield a lot of that, and some years the crops yield a small amount of that. And so in the years where there's a lot, we accumulate excess inventory. In the years where there's not a lot, we draw down our inventories, but we try to keep enough so that we can make this 1.2 million cigars a year consistently. Now, obviously, there's wrapper shortages, like we've seen that in Broadleaf, we've seen it in San Andreas, we've even seen it in Ecuador, Connecticut. But that's one aspect of the answer to your question, is we look for very specific kinds of tobaccos, and we work with suppliers that know exactly what we're looking for. The second answer is that there's this myth, this concept that people who grow tobacco use the best tobacco for themselves and they sell everything else, because that makes sense, right? If they're a manufacturer, but economically that doesn't make sense, and it's also not true. There are people who grow tobacco, like the Padrones, that don't sell it no matter what. They take they sort it into 3 or 4 different groups of texture, quality, body, They have a core line of cigars for a certain grade of their tobacco from their 3 farms. They have the next level and then they have the higher level, and then they have kind of their limited stuff that they are able to do very special projects with, really limited. But they eat the whole cow, right? But then you have growers where they're growing a lot of tobacco, and maybe they trade their best filler tobacco, the highest quality filler tobacco, the highest texture, they trade that for wrapper. Or maybe they sell that for 3 or 4 times what it costs to produce, and then it basically subsidizes the rest of their raw material. So when they're actually making cigars, they're making cigars with tobacco that's paid for or subsidized at least from the tobacco that they sold, right? So and then there's people who grow tobacco who do nothing but grow tobacco. And obviously, if you're making 30 million of something, you're never going to be able to get, like the model at Drew Estate. One of the things that people don't really understand is the fact that they make acids, which are a very popular product with very high quality, long filler sound tobacco, but it's all mostly low priming. So they can go buy whole crops of tobacco, and they have a product within their factory, a portfolio, where, for example, if they buy broadleaf, they can use the thinnest of broadleaf, either in acid or in other things, and then they can use the 10 or 15% of the highest quality stuff, say in Liga Privada or other products. But they have the ability within the walls of their factory to eat the whole cow, right? And so when you go out there and you're only looking to buy certain premium cuts of tobacco at certain grades with certain textures that are fermented a certain way, there's a much more limited ability to do that. But my partner at the factory, Esteban, has been buying tobacco in Esteli since the late 90s, so for 30 plus years. So he has relationships with those people in the Dominican. We have relationships with those people in Mexico. We have relationships with those people in, for example, the Schusters have relationships in Brazil that we leverage for our Matafina and for our Arapiraca. And then of course, Esteban's, kind of roots in the Dominican. He has connections with people like Leo Reyes and other people that grow. So, again, there's no secret in how to do it, but there is a hard and fast decision to do it consistently and not to cut corners, which, sometimes creates a little bit of a stress point. But for us being small, we're pretty agile, and we're able to maintain those standards without trying, sacrificing for one reason or another. And that's really what the craft is, right? It's saying it's all about the product. We're going to be okay whether we, make $1 million this year, or whether we make $500,000 this year or $2 million this year. We're going to be okay either way. We're just going to do it the right way so that we also do well next year and the year after that.
You're a big fan of barbecue, where it's actually about taking lesser cuts of meat and working with them, massaging them almost for a prolonged period of time in order to get a fantastic result. Whereas your approach with tobacco is probably a little different, and you're rather trying to get the filet mignons and just the prime cuts of tobacco. At the end of the day, is that just a numbers game and a matter of putting more money on the table?
There's a lot of that. You mean in terms of having access to that kind of tobacco? I think there's a lot of things involved. One, it's because we don't need a lot of it. That's the biggest secret, right? Is that, we only make 250,000 broadleaf cigars. So, if we wanted to make 1 million, we couldn't do it the same way. Some years we maybe could, some years we couldn't. Most years we couldn't. So number one, it's because we don't make a lot of anything, which makes it easier for us to find, let's say this year in the whole universe, there's 50,000 pounds of the kind of tobacco that we need to make Cro-Magnon. The fact that we only need 10% of it instead of 50% of it makes a big difference, right? Another aspect is, like I said, is those relationships that Esteban has. And then, another thing that works in our favor is, while some factories have gotten into making limited cigars off of that kind of tobacco and charging, $20, $25 for those cigars, the majority of big factories don't really want to invest the time and energy into making something that only makes 150, 250,000 of something. Because once you layer on salespeople and new branding and marketing people and advertising, the economics just don't work out for really small runs, unless they're very expensive. So, and then there's a limited, there's a limited market for $25 cigars, right? So, for us being able to make those kinds of quality cigars really boils down to the fact that we make very small numbers of them. In terms of, there are, for example, Arapiraca is a good example. It's not a really great tobacco to work with. It's really long and thin. It's fragile. You have to really do it slow over a long period of time. So, like, for example, the wrapper that we use in our Brazil Arapiraca, which is like a $7 cigar, takes 4 or 5 years to ferment to get it the way you want. Now, you can put it through other kinds of processes and get it dark, but it doesn't have the flavor when you do it through that way. And there's just not very many people who are going to say, hey, I want to use a wrapper material that takes 5 years to get from the point you buy it to the point you can use it, right? Especially when the amount of experience you have to have from a roller perspective, from a sorting perspective, from a despadillo perspective, all those kinds of things, it's different with Arapiraca. So it doesn't make sense to use that kind of product, that kind of material, if it's just not economically feasible if you want to make a lot of something. And if you don't want to make a lot of it, it doesn't make sense for some companies to even do it. So, but if you do it low and you do it slow and you do it over time and you know how to do it, it produces something that's very unique. And at the end of the day, being differentiated in a market that's so crowded with options is important.
Actually, I feel we can never get bored with basics. I mean, so many people were just commenting over on Facebook and sending messages that they thoroughly enjoy the very detailed explanation, and great to get those insights from you, Skip. Because we not just want to provide a community platform and bring people together, building bridges, but if we can throw a little education on top, that's even better. So thanks for that wonderful explanation. We had a question from Ian, who is here with us at the lounge.
Hi, Skip. Really enjoying this, and it was great to meet you at Bureau Sabor, and I'd encourage everyone to come. I've probably smoked more RoMa Craft in the last 3 years than anything else, and I've really loved them. They're really great cigars. And I know you're very well known for your powerful cigars, the Intemperance and the Cro-Magnon. But I've actually enjoyed some of your milder cigars, and I don't know whether you want to push those, because I think they're great. And I think a lot of people like the milder cigar. Certainly sometimes a day I want a mild one. So I would encourage you to push those, because you seem to have a talent to produce a really good quality cigar that's also mild but flavorful and most enjoyable.
Yeah, it's actually, ironically, it's harder to make a really good, flavorful, mild cigar than it is to make a strong cigar. Obviously, first of all, a strong cigar will cover up a lot of errors. If there's a little bit of variance in the tobacco, the stronger it is, the less you're going to notice it. But the other thing is that thinner tobaccos are harder to know exactly how they're going to taste in the finished product than a stronger tobacco. And so, Davidoff, for example, is a good example of a company that's able to use, milder flavored tobacco, milder, lower body, milder, lower strength tobacco But the thing is it's super, super, super complicated. I mean, they analyze and they control the tobacco from the time it goes into the ground, the seed, the soil composition. They have really good chemical controls. They have really good environmental controls, and all the way through the curing process, the fermentation process, and even then, they're so familiar with those kinds of tobaccos that they even sort out things that look exactly the same into different categories for different kinds of products. We just aren't involved enough, or in that level of the production in order to do a lot of that. When we take on a project that's something that's milder, like for example, the Schuster Casa Torres, the anniversary cigar we made for them, that's a really mild cigar for something that comes out of our factory. It probably is 3 times the amount of work to produce that cigar than what our normal cigars would be. And so it's just not something that we kind of can do really efficiently, differentiated from other people consistently. And so we don't do a lot of it. But like our Baca project this year is I would say is milder than most things we make. And again, we only made I think 35 or 40,000 of those cigars, but it takes a lot more work than our normal production.
I think the work is worth it because they're super cigars, and I think don't sell yourself short. They're really good cigars, and I love them. So
thank you. Now, fortunately, you're like there's not very many people that think that way. So, me included, right? I often, I could smoke anything I want, and often where I go to the cabinet, I'm almost always picking up something we make. But where I always, there are times where I do really want something milder and flavorful, and I'm always like, man, I wish we had more of that in our, our quiver. But we just don't make cigars like that. And also in Nicaragua, it's harder to make cigars like that because the kinds of tobaccos that you need they aren't available in Nicaragua.
Yeah, but the Padron are a very nice one, and Steve Sacker's now done his Brûlée, and I think yours are really up there. They're really super cigars. So that's my opinion, and I may be in a minority, but I love them. So there we are.
Oh, thank you. Well, you mentioned the Brûlée. That's made by Hoy de Nicaragua, and Hoy de Nicaragua doesn't sell their tobacco. Steve has access to that cigar because Steve makes that cigar with Juan Martinez. Again, that goes back to one of the disadvantages. We use 2 kinds of Honduran tobacco in our Baca. That's probably the hardest tobacco, believe it or not, to source. It was harder to source than the Cameroon. So because people like the Aroas and Plasencia, they don't want to cut loose of even a small amount of that really good kind of Jamastran tobacco. So I guess if I was making cigars at those people's factories, it would be a lot easier for me to do that.
Now, since we're already discussing strength a little bit here after Ian's question, what do you think about the concept of taking a powerful cigar and keeping it in your humidor for quite a bit, where some of the rough edges might round off, and you will probably have a bit of a more mellow overall smoking experience than when you take the cigar freshly and smoke it right away?
Well, so here's my opinion on this, and I don't know if this is scientifically correct, but just based on 25 years of smoking cigars. Last night we picked out a couple of the original Camacho diplomas from at least from 2003, probably even earlier than that. So they're at least 17 years old, and they still have a lot of body, right? Because that tobacco is just really high texture, high strength tobacco. And because it's processed correctly and it's legitimately, that kind of material, that cigar is still going to be very, very strong. I mean, even very hard to retrohale, it's so strong. and it's 17 years old. I think a lot of people confuse harshness with strength. If you have a cigar that you think is really strong and you put it in a humidor and 3 or 4 years later it's reduced by half, then what that strength was in the beginning was harshness. It wasn't really, built into the leaf of the tobacco. It was something in the fermentation. It was something in the processing of the tobacco that made it seem really strong, like it was under fermented, or it was they used some kind of process in the fermentation that made it seem like it was really strong, but really that will go away. So I think that there are because mild cigars don't have kind of the body to hide things like off-gassing that happens at all stages, no matter how long you ferment them. As soon as they get humidity, they're going to off-gas again. So in a milder cigar, the longer you keep it, the more that kind of off-gassing and things dissipate. So I think you'll notice in milder cigars a lot more than stronger cigars, the benefits of fermenting over a longer period of time. Really, it's just the normalization of the humidity within the cigar, but the drying out. But in stronger cigars, if you see if you say, hey, I want to smoke RoMa Craft, but I don't like strong cigars, and you say, I buy some, and then I'm going to keep them for 5 years so that I can enjoy them when they reach a level where I can enjoy them. There might be some of that. I mean, I have cigars from 2010 that we made that are just as much body as when we made them, but the maybe they are smoother around the edges a little bit, but if I wanted to make that kind of cigars, then I would do that. But so I would say, I think the aging thing has come around because for two reasons. One, because cigars will last forever if you humidify them properly. But two, because there's a certain country where cigars come from where you can't smoke them if they're not aged. They're unbearable, right? Because they're under fermented. They're not dried out at the factory. They're put immediately into a box. So if you're buying cigars of that type, there's this the connoisseurs of those types of cigars have created this kind of idea that the longer the cigar is aged, the better it is, because you have to age it a long time for it to be good, right? Whereas most of the cigars that are coming out of Nicaragua, the Dominican, I mean, certainly a Davidoff cigar that's in a box, you could smoke that today. It's going to be exactly what it's supposed to be. You don't need to age it. If you age it for 5 or 6 years, it should taste just as good, but it's not going to taste any better. And to the extent that it does change, then maybe you're picking the wrong cigar to begin with. If you only enjoy it after 5 years, I think it's a positive thing that you can enjoy the cigar over multiple years and see a little bit of a change in it. But if you need to age it for a long time to enjoy it, then you probably should be smoking something different.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and it's like purchasing a car, where the car dealer might tell you got to wait 5 years until you can actually drive the whole thing.
Yeah, or they tell you, hey, this thing's going to really keep its value if you don't drive it. It's like, well, then why do I own it, right?
Yeah. We have a question from Brian over in California regarding beer and cigars. Fire away, brother.
Hello, good morning, good evening. There's a lot of controversy online, stuff being written about craft breweries and selling out. And there's a lot of arguments on both sides in terms of, shopping local and supporting, boutique businesses, and people stop, like Lagunitas or Golden Road and companies selling some of their company to like Anheuser-Busch or whatever. And then people argue on the other side, who cares? Now Anheuser sells a better beer. What's the big deal? They're reaching a bigger market. Or, I'm just curious kind of your opinion on that. And I'm wondering if there's an equivalent in the cigar world of like a company being small, producing this great product, and then reaching a point where they kind of just cash in on it.
Yeah, no, I understand the question. So I would say there's a couple of different answers. The first thing is there's all kinds of options in terms of which companies to support with your consumer dollar, and different reasons why you do that, right? Sometimes let's say you have 10 cigar companies and the quality of their product is very similar. I mean, again, we all buy tobacco from the same place. We all use the same processes generally to make cigars. If you go to plain packaging and you take the band off and you take the box away and you take the personalities away and all that, and all you have is like the round brown cigar in the box, what people would realize really quickly is that a lot of them are very similar. So where you're trying to support a company, sometimes it's because you're supporting something beyond what just the product is, right? Like, I don't really get involved in the social responsibility of, the people who make my laundry detergent or my shampoo, right? I just want it to be the same every time I use it. But for example, if I'm buying something like a cigar or a beer or a wine, maybe it matters to me more that it's local and that my money's going to someone who's local, or maybe it matters to me that the person has a certain political bent, or that a person does certain things from a charity perspective, or that they are more environmentally conscious or whatever, right? So different consumers have different reasons for buying. So for example, if you're supporting a company for one of those reasons, because it's local, because they are really focused on the environment, because they take really good care of their employees, or whatever, and that company sells out to a big company that doesn't have those same values, then there's been a fundamental change in the value proposition for you as a consumer, right? So even if the product doesn't change, even if nothing else changes, just the change in ownership changes the dynamic of why you buy from that company, right? And I think that happens in a lot of cases with cigar companies. It happens in a lot of cases with, for example, Fred Rui had a brand called Nomad. Fred Rui spent a lot of time on the road building relations with people. There are a lot of people who smoked Nomad because they, wanted to support Fred individually. When Fred sold that company to another small company, who people maybe didn't know, there may be people who stopped smoking that just because, even if the product was still made in the same factory the same way, right? So that's one answer to it. Another answer is that if the product itself changes when it goes from one company to another. So for example, let's say I smoke a brand that's a brand owned by a guy who makes it in factory A, and then I really support him because I love the product and the tobacco they use and the blends. And then they're making it in another factory. They change factories, even though the same guy owns it. You may not like the product the same, even if they use the same kinds of tobaccos, because it's made in a different factory or in a different country. It's going to change. So the actual fundamental product itself may have changed, and that's why you don't like it anymore. The third thing I would say is that being a small company in the cigar business doesn't mean you're able to make cigars better. There's this thing around boutique. So I went on a tour of a beer factory in Kansas City called Boulevard. I don't know if you're familiar with Boulevard. So Boulevard was made by this guy he was one of the early craft beer makers, very popular regionally, and also was getting kind of popular across the country. Then he sold half of his company to a European kind of wine champagne company, and all of a sudden they got $1 billion worth of capital invested. Well, nothing fundamentally changed in terms of the values of the company or even necessarily the product. But when you went to Boulevard the way they used to do it in 50 barrel kind of fermenters. And now they're using 500 barrel fermenters. And just the physics of making beer at 500 barrels at a time versus 50 barrels at a time changes the beer, right? And then over time, as the bigger company exerts influence and it affects how they make certain kinds of products, not only did the processes change, but then the materials changed, where they source materials. So let's say, for example, you have a big, huge cigar company that buys a small cigar brand, like CAO, for example. Before when CAO was really popular, a lot of their tobacco was coming from a certain place, certain kinds of tobaccos from a certain guy who owned half the factory. But then after, slowly 2 or 3 years after, they started changing a lot of the tobaccos that are in the cigars with tobacco that bigger company had, better access to. Is it better or worse? That's all opinion, but it absolutely changed, right? So the X cigar that you used to buy in 2000 is different than the X cigar that you buy in 2020. So, I think there's all kinds of answers in terms of dynamics to it. It goes back to what I said about our company, which is if we focus our company on the product, on the tobacco, how we make it, aging it, making it consistently, so that a Cro-Magnon you buy in 2010 is the same as a Cro-Magnon you buy in 2020, then whether I'm still an owner or not shouldn't really make a difference. I'd also add that.
Yeah, I agree with all that.
Yeah, I would also add that sometimes, capital makes things happen. So there are certain things that small companies maybe, for example, for us, we are in a fortunate position where if all of a sudden 10 years worth of San Andreas became available, I would buy it, right? We would figure out a way to move the capital over and buy 10 years worth of that rapidly, which would mean that we would secure our ability to make San Andreas for the next 10 years. A lot of small companies don't, when they have money, it's not available. When it is available, maybe they don't have money. So having a big company as a financial backer to be able to take advantage of things like that can make a company work better for the consumer. One of the things you mentioned is like Anheuser-Busch buying half of a company, right? In the cigar business, we really haven't seen where a big company just says, hey, we're going to own half of your company, but we're going to leave you alone and let you do it the way you do it. What's happened in our industry is they've kind of assimilated them like the board, right? So, resistance is futile. You're going to become part of our conglomerate. and a lot of times that doesn't work out well, right? Like Camacho, even though Davidoff's a brilliant company, Camacho is not the Camacho it used to be, right? It's different tobacco, it's different branding, it's different packaging, it's different blends, it's different everything. It's not all that they bought was the name, essentially. I think another example of that would be say Terrano, right? We have very deep connections with Terrano going back decades. Terrano is basically a catalog brand now, right? It doesn't exist anymore, essentially. So.
Yeah.
But then there's not really a lot of examples of companies that got purchased where they got better, I would say. I can't think of one off the top of my head of one that got, but I think there certainly is an opportunity in our industry for some of these big companies to invest in small companies that are doing things the right way. So those small companies could build better factories, can have better access to inventory, can maybe do a little better job on packaging and branding and other things, take the stress off the money side, and then just do a better job of executing the small company. Inevitably, though, the problem is if say Scandinavia or one of these big companies comes in and invests, $20 million, $30 million into RoMa Craft, they're not going to just leave me alone, right? They're not going to be happy with getting 25% return on investment on $4 million or whatever. They're going to want, hey, can we grow that to 8? Can we grow that to 12? Can we grow that to 20? And then that's where a lot of the, our company's just not built to work that way. So then, it would eventually be just buy the other half. I'm going to, the French Riviera or whatever.
Yeah. Complicated. I agree with all that. That's really interesting. Do you think there's a responsibility on the entity to kind of have some transparency? It's frustrating sometimes. I think like you have to really do some research if you'd like to find out what company owns the other company, and they'll just market it like it never happened, and you think you're buying craft and you're not.
Well, I mean, again, if it's the reason why you're buying the product and it really matters to you, then I think it's really on you as a consumer to be informed. And we live in a time where there's more information available to everyone, and people seem to be less informed somehow, ironically. So, if I sold half of my company secretly to an outside investor, I don't think I owe you any obligation to say, hey, somebody else owns half of my company. But I think the biggest obligation companies have, and in the cigar business, this is not something we do really well, because there's so much bullshit in the cigar business. Everything's a story, and half of those stories aren't true. Like I blended this, or I went to this secret mountain and found this tobacco, or this is somehow a magical potion that whatever it is, or I know this thing that no one else knows, or there's so much of that, like I own the factory, or I do this, or I do that. What we really try to do is we try to be transparent, and we try to be honest about everything, just because that's the easiest thing. Like when you're making a really good product, you don't really have to, and you only make so much of it. We're going to sell it no matter what. So we don't really have to do a lot of bullshitting in order to convince people who aren't familiar with us to buy it. But unfortunately, because it is such a competitive space, there is a lot of that in the cigar world, especially even in Europe, where it's so romanticized, and it's such a emotional connection to the product. Like I've been to Cuba, I've seen the farms. I know what good tobacco looks like. I know what that tobacco looks like. I know what happens in the factory. I know that different shades go to different brands, even though they were rolled as the same cigar. I know these things, but if you try to tell a guy who loves Cuban cigars any of that, it's like telling him that, it's like telling a Mormon that, hey, the leader of your church didn't walk into the woods and find another part of the Bible, right? It just doesn't pay off trying to convince them of that. So, to each their own. I would rather just be informed and understand, and some people just want the magic, right?
Yeah. Cheers. Thank you.
Yeah.
So it's always a juggle. It's always finding that balance and the equation between the monetary supply, finding the best raw materials. Sometimes you actually might stumble across something, and you have to take the opportunity once it presents itself, which is probably also a bit linked to the Baca story and how you got to work with the Cameroon tobacco, right? Mark over on Facebook had a question regarding that particular Cameroon tobacco of yours that you use on the project.
Well, all Cameroon comes from the same place. Like all legitimate African Cameroon comes from the Marifel family. I don't know if there's anybody else braver or dumb enough to try to operate a tobacco business, which is already hard enough in a country like Cameroon, where you have 1,000 other factors that make it more difficult. So it all comes from the Marifels. They have long relationships with certain people, and we just happen to be able to get a very small quantity of tobacco from one of those people. It goes back to sometimes better isn't necessarily better. And what I mean by that is, if you're making cigars with Cameroon, which is really not fermented, it's just how it comes out of the curing barn is the color it's going to be. There are certain shades of that tobacco that are too dark, for example, for you to use in the products you use them for. So if you're buying Cameroon in bulk and some of it just turns out to be too dark or too small or too whatever, then that tobacco is, even though it may be quote unquote better to some people, objectively, it's not good for what you're trying to do with it. So on the fringes, like for example, with our Candela, majority, or the reason why you use Candela is because it's inexpensive. And if you use a lot of Candela, Ecuador, Connecticut Candela, for example, if you use a lot of it, you want it to be a very consistent light shade of green. Well, sometimes it's thicker and sometimes it's darker. And that stuff is, you can't use it. So we swoop in and buy that thicker, darker stuff, because it's very small quantities. It's like 2 pounds today or this week, 6 pounds next week. And then once we have 50, 100 pounds of it, then we make cigars, right? So again, it goes back to being able to do things on really small quantities and make them work economically. It allows us to go grab tobacco that I think is better just because it's on the fringe of what other people use. It happens with Cameroon. It happens with our Ecuador, Connecticut to a certain extent. It happened because we use darker of all three of those things, Cameroon. So we're able to, it doesn't naturally occur in consistent quantities. So you can't, if you're a big company, you can't build a whole line of cigars around darker Ecuador, Connecticut, or darker Candela, or darker, smaller Cameroon. But we can move in there and grab it and make a certain kind of project, right?
If you use a particular type of tobacco and you probably run out of stock or of supply of that particular type, is that just the end of the story there and you need to focus on something else? Or do you refactor and rework the blend in a certain way to still provide the same smoking experience, but probably with a slightly different appearance in terms of colors, visuals?
Well, the answer is both. So we don't really focus on the aesthetics of the tobacco as much as we focus on the flavor. So you'll see like really rough, a lot of veins and stuff in our Cro-Magnon and our Octane, because the Habano is so heavy and the Octane, it is what it is. So it's easier for us to use that where other people, for example, our Aquitaine was blended. Ernie Carrillo told me we were in the pre-industry looking at our broadleaf and trying to figure out what we were going to make, because the broadleaf wasn't going to be ready for another year and a half. And ran into Ernie Carrillo, said, hey, we were thinking about using Habano. He goes, hey, there's this really thick, heavy tobacco over here that is too heavy for, at that time, he was working on 4 Kicks with Mike Condor and Hubert. And he was there looking at this tobacco, and he said, this is way too heavy for me because there's not enough of it, and also it's not what we use, but it's great tobacco. You should consider using that. And that's how we ended up, using that kind of tobacco for Aquitaine. But then down the road, when we were buying a lot more of that kind of tobacco, and we would start doing whole pilones full, what would happen is naturally within the pilone, 15, 20, 30% of it would become thinner, and it wouldn't be what we use on Aquitaine. Now, a lot of people would say that that's better, that this thinner, more beautiful, kind of a little bit lighter, less veiny tobacco is actually better to use. And there are people who make millions of cigars with that kind of tobacco, but we didn't have a product to use that kind of tobacco on. So that's when we started using that tobacco for little projects like the leaf by Esteban. Then we used it for the Abaddon, and then when we had enough of it, and our amount we were using for Aquitaine was so large, that we had a lot of that consistently. That's when we started using it for Whiskey Rebellion. So, I think what happens, the first half of that answer is sometimes whatever they give you, you end up making something limited, or you expand it to a line like Whiskey Rebellion, or you just let the natural variances happen in the line, as long as it doesn't affect the flavor. Sometimes you use the exact kind of tobacco, but it's changed. For example, Condega, there are years where they don't have a lot of rain. There's years where they had a lot of rain. about 3 or 4 years ago, there was a little bit of a drought, and the tobacco, the Viso we were getting from Bodega was really, really, really strong. And so when we started using that in one of our blends, it was really strong, and it almost acted like a Ligero for us. But it was still, from a body perspective, wasn't as heavy as Esteli, but it functioned from a strength perspective with a lot of flavor. And then 2 years later, that tobacco is a lot lighter. So what you have to do with that blend is you have to stop using Viso Condega and you have to start using Ligero Condega. So the blend itself has changed because the tobacco changed, right? So you have to use higher texture tobacco in order to get the same strength. But then what happens is you lose some of the flavor. So then you have to adjust some other kind of thing in the blend in order to bring the flavor back up. So there is part of the, when people say I blended the cigar, I always say the blending is a process, not an event. So you're constantly doing it in the selection of tobacco and the fermentation process, even the buncher blends at the table, right? Where they tear, what kind of what part of the leaf they use on the wrapper, where they put the break back into the cigar. That is part of the blending process, right? And it happens on each and every individual cigar. Sometimes the tobacco is smaller, so you use the break in a different way, and sometimes the tobacco is bigger. Maybe you use the edge in a different way. So, or maybe you'll tear the tips, right? Depending on how the tobacco is that day. So, what we don't do is we don't say, hey, the broadleaf is a little bit lighter this year. There's no heavy broadleaf, but we still have to make 350,000 cigars. So let's just make Cro-Magnon different this year, right? And it's gonna not be as good, but hey, we'll sell it. There was 7 or 8 months where we didn't make Neanderthal because we couldn't get the tobacco the same way. So sometimes if you can't get Esteli Ligero, there are factories that will just throw Esteli Viso in there. It's like, who's going to know the difference? 75% of consumers don't know the difference. So
I think you made an excellent point there, that always being on top of the blending game is not necessarily a once in a lifetime happening where you come up with something and that's the end of the story, but it's really readjusting with every single crop or with every single new pile of tobacco that you get in, and always work on those intricate little details. Interestingly enough, me being the manufacturer of my own craft vermouth, I always say it's like an herbal equation, and whenever one of those botanicals changes, you need to rework and refactor the entire blend, because changing one single component will also affect and alter how all the other elements come together and work together. So it's a constant process of readjusting, and very interesting to hear that from your side as well.
Yeah, and it goes back to kind of the BS thing I was saying before, which is, if someone says, "Hey, I blended this cigar," it's like, okay, what kind of tobacco's in the cigar? And then if you set 10 tobaccos on a table, 70% of these guys couldn't pick out the 4 tobaccos that they say that they blended their cigar with, right? So if you're a brand owner, there's a certain skill set in there that a lot of there's old school tobacco guys who know everything there is to know about tobacco, who have a lot of challenges figuring out how to brand and sell a cigar. So there's definitely a whole skill set in being a brand owner that is valuable and worthy. You don't have to pretend to be a tobacco guy, right? And then there's a whole skill set in being a tobacco guy that I will never get to. That's worthy, and you don't have to have your own brands, right? You don't have to be a marketing genius, right? It's this idea that in our company, we have Mike, who's a great sales guy, great relationship guy. We have Esteban, who's a real deep tobacco guy. He also is a great leader of people, in the factory. And then I'm kind of more of a business guy. I understand a little bit of this world, a little bit of that world, and I kind of pull the whole thing together to make it something that's a company, right? But we all have our different skill set, and I don't go out there trying to pretend to be something that I'm not. which I think that authenticity is something that is part of the reason why I think over time people really appreciate our company and support us.
Johan, brother, you had a question.
Skip, I really love your cigars. You know that anyway. I have a question of how is it with some new lines over here in Europe? Is there a chance to get the Whiskey Rebellion? I mean, I know that Barca is really rare. I think you use them all for the United States. I had the chance to smoke one in Chicago, and it was really, wow, amazing this year. So is there anything you can ship over the big ocean to Europe to give us some new stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think this year we're going to extend the Whiskey Rebellion to the Schusters, so you'll be able to get that. I think we're actually doing less Neanderthal to Europe. In fact, in 2021, I don't think we'll send a single Neanderthal to Europe because the Schusters say that it's too strong for Europe.
I'm smoking one actually, so
yeah,
please continue shipping, man.
I know. If you and Silly Delay smoke all of it, that doesn't really account for a lot of the demand. But no,
I believe you just sealed Aldo's move to the United States. He's coming over. I'm telling you that.
You know, the thing is, we make as many cigars as we can make the right way, and I try to. If the Schusters give me a good order, like a timeline, over like 4 or 5 or 6 months, I can fill that order and set it aside for them and get it over to them. But the reality is, you know, we have, everybody says, you know, there's this misconception that we only make cigars to demand. We make as many cigars as we can, and there's always going to be more demand than we can fill. So, for example, Neanderthal HN is probably back ordered for 6 months. But that doesn't mean it's not available. Every single shipment, every 10 or 15 days, we get a lot of Neanderthal, but it was sold on an order 4 months ago, right? So whoever ordered it 4 months ago is going to get it, and then next shipment, whoever ordered it 3 months ago is going to get it, and then, but that doesn't necessarily happen with the Schusters. What the Schusters give me an order, and I try to peel off enough for them before it ever leaves the factory. And you know, we can't make enough is really the problem. So we do everything we could possibly do besides raising prices to keep, you know, people happy. But
thank you, and I will be happy with the cigar with the Whiskey Rebellion. Thank you. Very
yeah,
decent. Thank you so much.
We'll send some of that over. That's really good.
Perfect.
We had a quick follow-up question in regards to the blending aspect we discussed before, and in particular the rollers role in the whole equation. How do you make sure that, because you mentioned they have a certain flexibility and liberty to readjust when they're working a relief, that you still get the overall quality guidelines and standards that you're expecting? I mean, you've certainly got a lot of skilled people and only working with the very best, but how can you really have them all on track to what you want to achieve?
Well, everybody has the best, right? That's what. So there's a couple of things that play into it for us. Number one, we're small. So for example, we only need 12 pairs of rollers, right? So we only have 24 seats. So if you're trying to fill 1,200 seats, obviously you have to go deeper into the talent pool than you do if you only need 24, number one. Number two, because we're in the middle of town, the people who work with us really like that they don't have to get on a bus and ride out to the edge of town, that they can walk over or ride a bike, go home for lunch and come back, whatever, right? So they like that. The third one is we take really good care of our people. So once someone starts working for us, it's very rare that they leave. So, you know, every now and then we'll lose someone because they had a baby and they don't want to come back, or because they went into a different field like nursing or whatever. But for the most part, you know, in 10 years, we've only lost like 10 or 11 employees out of our 70 employees, right? So we've had like 80 something employees over the course of 10 years, but the core of our employees are the same people. And you keep them by keeping them happy, right? It's very common for people to turn over from one factory to another. And generally, if someone leaves from us, generally there's never going to be a seat back in, right? So they don't leave because they're happy. We pay generally better than most factories, and that isn't just because we're nicer. It's because the job in our factory requires a lot more skill. And so I'll explain what I mean by that. So my partner, Arlen, her sister and her family have worked with the Padrones for decades, right? Her sister makes one size of cigar for the last 10 years and always makes that size cigar very specifically the way that the Padrones want it made. If she spent a lot of time, she could probably make other sizes or other kinds of cigars or work with other kinds of wrappers, but she just doesn't have that experience. She's only worked with one kind of tobacco and one cigar and one size, and she's very, very good at it. She can make 450, 500 a day because that's all she's ever done. But in our factory, and that's by the way, that's common in a lot of factories. If you work at AJ Fernandez, maybe you only work with a certain blend and a certain size because there's 1,200 people. So you're working with maybe one or two different kinds of cigars, you know, right, at a time. In our factory, you might be making Cro-Magnon this week in 56, 5x56, and then Thursday and Friday, you might be making a Perfecto in 5x50. And then next week, you're making Ecuador, Connecticut in a 4.5x60 or whatever, right? Or, you know, there are certain people in our factory that are better at Perfectos or better at Figurados. But for the most part, everyone kind of changes the cigar that they're making from day to day. And the way we account for that is if it takes you longer to make a Perfecto than it does to make a 4x46 Parejo, then the price that we pay you to make that cigar is adjusted so that your salary is still really good at the end of every week, no matter which product you're working on. Whereas in some factories, you get paid more based on how difficult the cigar is. So you want to work your way up to making the hardest cigars to make so that you're making the most money. Does that make sense? In our factory, pretty much everybody does really well because we adjust the amount we pay by cigar so that you can make them leisurely, correctly, and still make a decent salary, right? So for the most part, the way, I would summarize is that to say we have to have better people with a lot of experience, 10, 15 years of experience. Once we get them, because Esteban's worked in Esteli for 30 years, he knows them all. If a buncher leaves to become a preacher, we've got 50 guys who want to come work there, 100 guys who want to come work there. And Esteban knows every single one of them. He knows which ones are alcoholics. He knows which ones are, have relationship issues. He knows which ones are, really good, but have, piss off their coworkers. So he knows the pool of talent, and we very deliberately pick the right people so that once they're in place and we kind of get them into our system, they don't really leave. So that's a big part of the consistency of the rolling.
And I believe one of the biggest challenges for companies in almost every industry today to find the right talent and make sure you can keep them on board and keep them engaged.
Yeah, and if they reach a point where because some life situation or some desire to do something different, no matter how important they are to you, you got to say, hey, you got to do what you got to do, and we're going to support you. So one of our first employees just recently moved to Spain, but just to do a better job of providing for his family. So we helped support him to do that, even though it sucks losing one of your best people. That's happened a couple of times. Danny, here in our office here in Austin, Danny's daughter had a medical issue. He had to make a move. It didn't really work out for our company for him to work remotely, but we did everything we could do to kind of help him do that. And then we're going to support him, whatever he needs from us to help him, starting his new company, we're gonna try to help him do that. And so, taking care of people, being honest, being fair, they're pretty basic things, but they're not as common as you would think.
Speaking of, cigars are a uniting element. They bring people together from all walks of life. And as much as we all pride ourselves to be a part of that global community and the cigar family, sometimes we cannot help but realize that there's dividing lines and stark contrasts within that ecosystem as well, whichever way, shape, or form. What is your opinion on that, and on that cliche type of community but it's so true to a certain extent, but then sometimes you also realize there's quite a bit of friction. How can we actually work on that to bring the community, the camaraderie, and the industry even closer?
I don't know. I'll tell you, the last 4 years have been pretty challenging for me, because people that you would otherwise not really care what their politics are, suddenly becomes in your face, and their values are kind of really contradictory to your really deeply held values. And so you obviously can't be friends with those kinds of people if they don't share your values. You could be friendly with them. I mean, you could certainly, I'll sell you a cigar, you can enjoy it, we can talk about cigars, but we're not going to be, friends, right? We were talking earlier about how the internet and technology and social media has expanded the ability for me as a company to reach people like in Italy. But there's a double-edged sword, right? You also get insight into people. If someone has anti-immigrant sentimentalities, I have to feel a certain way about that living in Nicaragua and understanding the situation that pushes people to the border or whatever, right? Like if you have certain kind of racial animus, well, I've got people from all kinds of races and ethnicities working with me who are really close to me. Obviously, I have to feel a certain way about that, right? So, the cigar culture is really interesting in that if you take a small space like a cigar store, you're going to get all kinds of people. But because they're interacting face to face every day in a common situation, you can become friends over periods of time, even though you're all very different, right? But when you start introducing that same kind of access dynamic to a group of people who you've never even met, sometimes people get into that circle that are very disruptive, right? I mean, I hear from people all the time, like, I don't like your politics, I don't like the way you do this, I don't like the way you do that. I'm like, that's fine with me. Smoke the cigar, don't smoke the cigar, I don't care. Like, you don't have to like me personally. I don't even know you. So maybe I wouldn't like you either. I don't know. But because of the dynamic of the small store, there are people who are very antisocial, who've never had a real adult human relationship with another, have never had friends, they're very antisocial, but somehow they get into your circle because of it's the cigar community or the wine community or the beer community or whatever. And then you kind of just accept them because they're a part of your group of 20 people. And then you moderate them, they moderate you, and you figure out how to work it out. But when you get those kinds of people into a circle of 5,000 friends of people you've never met, they're very disruptive. And I've just come to the realization that I don't want to stop building relationships with people I don't know, because over decades I've found a lot of value. I mean, people like Johan and people, different people that I've known over the years. I interacted with Johan a little bit, and then at some point we met and hung around in Vienna, and it was like great to go to another side of the world and meet someone for the first time, but also kind of be friends with them. When Ian walked into our factory, even though I had never met him, he kind of knew us, but you know, that works both ways, right? And sometimes you just have to set boundaries and just be ready to let people go, right? And that includes me. If you want to let me go, let me go. And I have no burning desire to be a part of your life. You don't need to see my pictures of food and whatever. And if I upset you because, you know, I believe in a little bit of, you know, whatever, then feel free, cut me loose.
I mean, bless you. Then again, it becomes a matter of authenticity, as you mentioned before, right? It's like, do you? And if people like it, welcome to your ecosystem. If not, leave it aside.
Right. And also I've come to realize that at first blush, there's some people that kind of rub me the wrong way, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're a bad person, right? So you just have to not get into your feels about you know, you could be acquaintances with people without, you know, having to, you know, I don't know how else to say it. I'm sure you guys all deal with this. I mean, Brian Julian strikes me as someone who I'm certain Brian has, you know, people who he's had to cut out of his life, right? I know Johan probably tries to get along with everybody. He's that kind of guy, but you know, it's a cigar. It's a cigar. It's not a religious text. We could smoke it together. We could not smoke it together. It's, you know.
So if you could wish for something like either an evolution or a change or something for the better for the entire industry, looking at it a little more holistically and not on an individual relationship level, what would you say would be one of your personal wishes for the industry to evolve and get a step further?
You know, I don't know. I think this is one of the great things about capitalism, or, you know, the markets, is that those things kind of work themselves out. Like if things get kind of out of the norm, you know, they just disappear, or they become separated from the norm. You know, I like that a lot of new brands come in. I like that new people are opening factories. I like that they're challenging the status quo, because that competition is what makes everyone better, I think. You know, if you know, in these markets where there's, you know, no packaging, where there's no innovation, there's humongous taxes, then and the big companies have kind of squeezed everybody else out. It's like become boring, you know. I don't know, you know, the me that walked into a store and bought my first cigar that turned into a guy who's spent the kind of money and time, and cigars have become such a huge part of my life. I don't think if I walked into a store in 2020, I would end up in the same place 20 years from now, just because the dynamics of the world of cigars have changed so much. We have too much access, too much exposure, too much, you know, personalities, too much, you know, BS, too much emphasis on packaging, too many people who think they know more than they do, who don't really want to learn more. So I don't know. I don't think that situation existed in the 90s. But at the same time, we have better tobacco, better cigars than we've ever had. So I think it works just fine now. I just think, you know, everybody should just be okay working in their own little pocket, and you know, and happy with their own. If you like a certain thing, more power to you. You know, I'm not going to judge you if you like bad cigars, right? That's your choice. I mean, there's plenty of people who drink Bud Light. You know, if I was into judging, I would be judging those people. But if you're happy drinking Bud Light, then that's your thing, and you know, it doesn't affect me one way or the other. So the thing that really bothers me more than anything is that because of the competitive nature of the industry, and also the desire for people to be in it, what happens is a lot of times you get people who aren't a little shady that are trying to get in, or that are cutting corners. You know, you see all these thefts in Miami of cigar warehouses, and you hear about guys who, you know, aren't paying their bills, or guys who, you know, are constantly lying about one thing or another. And then at the same time, you still see consumers rewarding that behavior. So I guess more than anything, it's like if we would do a better job of holding ourselves accountable for ostracizing the bad actors, right? Like, if you're a guy that doesn't pay your bills, then retailers should, you know, then manufacturers should tell other manufacturers so they don't get burned by that guy. Or if you're a consumer who's, you know, selling, you know, promising to trade things online, and then you end up stiffing people, then that community needs to ostracize that guy from the community, right? Because all those negative things take away from the positive. And you know, as a community, if nothing else, we could do a better job of kind of policing ourselves.
Skip, it's been such a tremendous pleasure to hear all these very insightful comments and thoughts of yours, and even all the technical aspects. So many people thoroughly enjoyed it watching, and thank you for sharing all that with us. We also, of course, want to be respectful of your time, and so I'm truly grateful that you presented us with so much of that precious time. To all of you guys, please be most kindly invited to our little Christmas special and our cigar Christmas party next week on the 23rd. It's same time, same station as always, but we're going to have, like, I believe the current status is more than 25, probably more than 30 manufacturers already, our dear friends, former guests on the show. Skip, if you have time, please be our guest as well. Same time next week, even if it's for 5 minutes. We're going to share a little bit of Christmas and holiday cheer, and just have a good time together and bring a little Christmas spirit to a more than challenging year. So to all of you guys, please be most kindly invited as well. And you can find all information on lightemupworld.com. Skip, before we wrap things off, one final question. Looking back at the tremendous track record and the success story of RoMa Craft, everything that you've accomplished within the industry, and speaking about, of course, the tempting thought to grow the business, to boost up your production and the revenues and everything, where do you see the company headed? What's your vision, and what's your dream for RoMa Craft in the foreseeable future?
I mean, honestly, we want to keep doing what we do now. I like making 1 million cigars a year, selling 1 million cigars a year. You know, where we sell them, who we sell them to may change, but I don't foresee a lot of expansion of the product. I don't see a lot of growth. You know, we do really well in this little space that we're at, and we're really fulfilled in this spot. So I hopefully we'll be able to get out of our house when all this COVID stuff ends and start traveling again. I look forward to, you know, I really miss going to Germany this year. And even though I've liked being here in Austin for the last 8 months, I really need to get back to Nicaragua. So hopefully that's what changes for us, is the end of the global pandemic.
That's a very good point. Skip Martin.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much for your time, and it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. All the very best. Be safe, be healthy, and we'll hopefully see each other again super soon and smoke a cigar together in 2021.